Hello everyone, I am Aditya Basu. I am currently a PhD student at Penn State. Today I will be going over our work on compact printable shellcodes for x86. We will first go over why we need printable shellcodes and why do we want them to be compact. Then we'll go over a couple of currently used algorithms, and then we will introduce our tool to produce even more compact representations of printable shellcodes. We call the tool PSC, or Printable Shellcode Compiler. Next, we'll go over a couple of comparison slides comparing these currently known algorithms with PSC, and in the next section, we will subsequently conclude. So, why do we want printable shellcodes? Typically, most programs will have defensive filters wherever they get inputs. So these defensive filters will generally strip away all binary sequences from the input, rendering any shellcode that had binary characters pretty much useless, because it will no longer be a valid x86 code fragment. So the end result is that this will ruin most injection attacks. Now, to mitigate this or bypass these defensive filters, the attacker can generate a shellcode which always uses printable characters. So it will not have any binary sequences inside the shellcode. This will typically bypass these defensive filters, and hence printable shellcodes are pretty effective in conducting an attack. Now, one of the currently known algorithm is Riley Eller's algorithm. He made this observation that any double word or a sequence of 4 bytes can actually be derived with subtraction of 2 or 3 constants. Of course, these constants themselves are completely printable in nature when you look at their ASCII representation. This tool is also available as a Metasploit plugin, hence it's quite popularly used. Taking an example byte sequence from this classic shellcode, the code below shows the actual output by the Riley Eller's algorithm. As you can see, each and every constant here is within this printable range. So one observation here is that each and every byte that the Riley Eller's algorithm produces an overhead of 2.5 bytes with regards to the original shellcode byte. So in other words, for every byte of the original shellcode, Riley Eller's algorithm produces an output that takes at least 2.5 bytes to encode that single byte of the original shellcode. Another tool or example is the source-to-source conversion by Gezi and Avania. In this, they take binary sequences, or they take all binary instructions and replace them with semantically equivalent printable instruction sequences. A key drawback is the size of the final printable shellcode. As you can see, a 38-byte shellcode that they describe in their paper goes to over 9K bytes. Moreover, this tool is not really publicly available, so it's difficult to do any form of testing on this. So as we can see from the previous slide, transforming to these printable shellcodes typically increases the size of the shellcode. So this means that if we are, for example, trying to do a buffer overflow exploit, we will not be able to do them if our final printable shellcode is actually bigger than the buffer's size. However, if we have shorter shellcodes, they always fit inside smaller as well as larger buffers. So we get this win-win situation in which shorter the shellcode size, the better. So to do this, we demonstrate our work, and we have developed a tool called the Printable Shellcode Compiler to achieve this. In this section, we'll go over some of the design principles of the printable shellcode compiler, and then we will demonstrate how we test for correctness when we use this tool. So to dig into the compiler itself, it takes any arbitrary shellcode with arbitrary number of binary characters, and it produces a completely printable sequence of valid x86 code. The output is divided into 3 parts. The last part is where the encoded payload goes. This encoded payload is nothing but the output by our custom encoder. This encoder uses a custom or special encoding scheme that we have developed that takes this input shellcode and transforms those bytes of the input shellcode into completely printable bytes. So the final sequence of given any binary sequence or non-binary sequence is a completely printable binary sequence. However, note that this binary sequence is still not printable. So to make it executable, we do need to still recover the original shellcode. This is done at runtime with a small decoder loop prepended to the encoded payload. This decoder loop is 146 bytes long, and this is of course handcrafted to ensure that all the bytes in here are printable, because we don't want the final output to have any binary sequences in that. We also use a small custom XOR patcher, which is again handcrafted, that we load before the decoder loop. This is because the decoder loop itself has a couple of non-binary sequences, so it's not completely printable. To ensure that the final output is printable, we use this XOR patcher to recover the actual decoder at runtime first, and then this decoder goes ahead and recovers the original shellcode from the encoded payload. Now let's look into the encoded payload. This slide describes the encoding scheme that we use. As you can see, we take 2 bytes from the original arbitrary shellcode that's input to the tool. So we take 2 bytes of the input and expand it into 3 bytes. Now the bits from the original bytes are copied into these respective positions, as you can see from the color coding. And once these bytes are actually copied in, once these bits are copied into these bytes, all these bytes individually are incremented by 3f. This means that all these bytes B1, B2, and B3, which form the encoded payload, always lie in this range 3f to 7e. So for instance, if you consider the first byte B1, if bytes B0 through B3 are all 0, then the value of B1 will be 3f, that's the min. And if you consider the encoded byte B3, if all B10 through B15 are 1, then we will encounter the highest value of 7e, hence this range. Note that this range is actually a subset of the printable byte sequences. Hence, anything which is output by this custom encoder is also proper printable sequences. So it's completely printable. To undo this process at runtime, we use our runtime decoder. This runtime decoder essentially reverses this process. So we take 3 bytes of the encoded payload and get back 2 bytes of the original shellcode. We call it the recovered shellcode here, but it's essentially we are getting back the original shellcode. To do this, the highlighted portion shows the bitwise operations that we perform on B1, B2, and B3. These bitwise operations are performed inside a small loop that iterates over every 3 bytes of the encoded payload and overwrites them with 2 bytes of the recovered shellcode or the original shellcode. When the decoding loop encounters this ampersand or ASCII for 26 character, it realizes that it has completely recovered the original shellcode, and it just jumps over to the point where it recovered, or the memory location where it had been recovering the original shellcode. Now the encoder in the from the previous slide actually appends an ampersand to the end of the encoded payload. This is essentially to signify to the decoder that its end of decoding and the original shellcode has been, recovered. Now note that ASCII of 26 is actually outside the range of the encoded payload sequence. Hence, what ends up happening is the ampersand will always be outside this range. So anything which is encoded using the encoder will never have an ampersand in its original sequence. Now to test the correctness for this approach, we take the original sequence and insert this small shim layer or this small sequence that essentially just raises a sig term whenever the decoder completes its recovery for the original shellcode. Once the sig term is raised, a signal handler is invoked and it performs a byte by byte comparison of the recovered shellcode with the original shellcode. This is how we test for the correctness. Note that this sig term portion does not actually remain in the final output of PSC. This is only outputted, or this is only output when we are actually testing out the tool. This is a sample sequence or a sample run of PSC. The left side shows the binary sequence of the shellcode to spawn a shell on 4444 TCP port, and the corresponding printable sequence is shown on the right hand side. Note that the sequence ends with an ampersand to signify the end of the payload, and the front portion of 146 bytes is the constant overhead that's always present for each and every shellcode. You can find the tool at this given location and run it for yourself and see the results. In this section, we will compare PSC with the Riley Eller's algorithm and see how they differ and when does PSC outperform Riley Eller's algorithm. This slide compares the encoding performance of Riley Eller as well as PSC. With encoding performance, we mean the final overhead that is required to actually take every byte and transform it into a printable sequence. So for us, in case of PSC, we are comparing the encoded payload sizes when we are comparing it with the Riley Euler form. So it's the equivalent part of Riley Euler. We are just taking the subtraction operations there. The shellcodes are listed on the left hand side, and the gray bars show the original sizes of the shellcodes. As you can see, the colored bars are the encoded sections or the encoded regions, and they are always bigger than the original sizes. All these algorithms do have a size expansion. Now, the orange bar shows the Riley Eller's algorithm and PSC is represented by blue. As you can see, our encoding scheme does a better job for each and every shellcode as compared to the Riley Eller's algorithm. So we do outperform the Riley Eller's algorithm for all shellcodes in terms of raw encoding performance. However, when we look at the total size, we still outperform Riley Eller algorithm, but this is for larger shellcodes. To be precise, all shellcodes which are greater than 45 bytes long in their input, we will outperform Riley Eller. This is mainly due to the fact that we have this 146 byte overhead, which is fixed for each and every shellcode that we encounter. Hence, the higher overhead means that for very small shellcodes, we tend to produce larger output. In this slide, for the last shellcode, which is execve bin sh, Riley Eller performs better. However, for all other shellcodes, they are greater than 45 bytes long. Hence, PSC does a better job in terms of compactness of the final printable shellcode. A quick note regarding Alpha 3. Alpha 3 is a tool that can produce alphanumeric shellcodes given any binary shellcode. So the overhead here is a single byte is transformed into 2 bytes. However, note that PSC changes every byte into 1.5 bytes. So PSC does perform better as compared to Alpha 3. However, this encoding does make our decoder logic a bit more complicated. Hence, PSC still does beat Alpha 3. However, it's only for larger shellcodes where the original input size is greater than 236 bytes. Also, a quick note about alphanumeric shellcodes. Alphanumeric shellcodes are a subset of the printable range. Hence, any alphanumeric shellcode is also a valid printable shellcode. Now, in conclusion, we present a new encoding scheme in which we use looped decoding to generate compact printable shellcodes. On an average, they are 40 to 50% shorter as compared to the Riley Ellers algorithm. In future, we plan on adding support for 64-bit shellcodes, so be on a lookout for that. This slide lists all the tools that we referred to in the presentation, so please feel free to go and watch these or try these out. Thanks for going through the talk with me. This work was done by Dhrumil and myself under Professor Anish Mathuria. Please feel free to reach out for any questions or comments regarding the work. We will be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.